Open this door right now!
You've been warned multiple times about the state of this lawn. This is your final notice.
The letter arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning. Ethan Carter almost threw it away without opening it. From the outside, it looked like every other piece of boring neighborhood mail: white envelope, printed label, the logo of the Silver Oak Meadows Homeowners Association stamped in the corner. Most people in the neighborhood had received letters like this before. Usually they were harmless reminders about trash bins or lawn height. But this one was different, very different. Ethan stood in his driveway, coffee in one hand, envelope in the other. The autumn air in Colorado carried that cold edge that meant winter wasn't far away. His modest two-story house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, surrounded by identical suburban homes that looked like they'd been stamped out by the same factory. Same beige siding, same small trees, same HOA rules. Ethan sighed and ripped the envelope open. The letter inside was short, cold, and brutally official. Notice of violation. He frowned. Below the title was a photograph of his house, specifically his backyard. More precisely, the small wooden workshop he had spent 6 months building with his own hands. Ethan read the next line. Your recently constructed backyard structure has been deemed NON compliant with HOA community guidelines. Immediate removal is required within 14 days. Failure to comply will result in fines beginning at $250 per day. For a moment, Ethan just stared at the paper. Then he laughed, not because it was funny, because it was ridiculous. The workshop was barely bigger than a single-car garage. It sat neatly behind his fence, invisible from the street. He had built it slowly during weekends, carefully following the rules, or so he thought. Ethan flipped the page over, more text, more threats. Total projected fines after 30 days of noncompliance, $7,500. His smile faded. $7,000. He muttered, that wasn't a warning, that was punishment, and the worst part, at the bottom of the letter was a signature, Linda Marshall. HOA president. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. Linda Marshall, of course. She lived 3 houses down in the large corner property with the perfectly trimmed hedges and the expensive SUV that never had a speck of dust on it. Linda ran the HOA like a small kingdom, and everyone in the neighborhood knew it. She loved rules, she loved authority. And she loved reminding people that she had both. Ethan folded the letter slowly. Across the street, his neighbor Tom was dragging his trash bins toward the curb. Tom glanced over. HOA letter, he asked. Ethan raised the paper. Apparently my workshop is illegal. Tom let out a low whistle. Yeah, that sounds like Linda. Ethan walked over. You've had issues with her too. Tom laughed dryly. Last year she fined me $200 because my grass was 1 inch above community standard. You're kidding. I wish. Tom leaned closer. Look, man, if Linda's targeting you, it doesn't stop with one letter. Ethan frowned. What do you mean? Tom shrugged. It means she's decided you're a problem. The words hung in the air. Ethan looked back at his house. At the workshop behind it, 6 months of work, late evenings after his construction job, cutting wood, installing lights, building shelves. It wasn't just a shed. It was the place he planned to start his small woodworking business. Custom furniture, tables, cabinets, something of his own. And now, some HOA president wanted it demolished. Ethan took a deep breath. Does the HOA even have the authority to do this? He asked. Tom shrugged again. Honestly, nobody really knows. People usually just pay the fines. That answer didn't sit well with Ethan. Not at all. Because Ethan Carter had spent the last 15 years working construction across 3 states. He knew permits. He knew building codes. And one thing he knew for sure. Before building the workshop, he had gone down to the county office and filed for approval. He had the paperwork, stamped, signed, legal, which meant something didn't make sense at all. Ethan walked back toward his house slowly, the letter still in his hand. Inside, the kitchen smelled faintly of sawdust and coffee. He placed the letter on the table and opened a drawer. Inside was a thick folder. He flipped it open. There it was, county building permit approved. He read the date again. Approved 6 months ago. Inspection passed 2 weeks ago. Everything was perfectly legal. So why was the HOA calling it non-compliant? Ethan leaned back in his chair. Something about this didn't feel like a simple rule violation. It felt personal. And that thought brought him back to something that had happened a month earlier. A neighborhood meeting. Linda Marshall standing at the front of the small community hall, talking about maintaining property values. Talking about keeping the neighborhood professional. And then she had looked directly at him, at Ethan. "And we must ensure," she said sharply, "that unauthorized business operations do not begin appearing inside residential properties." At the time, Ethan thought it was just another HOA lecture. But now it sounded different. Now it sounded like a warning. Ethan grabbed the letter again. At the bottom in smaller text was another line. Mandatory HOA review hearing, Thursday 7:00 p.m. He checked the calendar. That was 2 days away. So they weren't just asking him to remove the workshop. They wanted him to come to a meeting to explain himself. Ethan rubbed his chin slowly. Fine, if they wanted a meeting. They would get one, but Ethan Carter wasn't the kind of man who walked into situations unprepared. He opened his laptop, typed a few words. HOA Authority V's County Building Permit. Dozens of legal articles popped up. Court cases, disputes, stories of HOAs overstepping their power. And one thing became clear very quickly. An HOA could enforce community guidelines, but it couldn't override county-approved construction without a very specific reason, which meant Linda Marshall needed more than just an opinion. She needed proof, and something told Ethan. She didn't have it. A slow smile appeared on his face. Maybe this wasn't going to be as simple as she thought. Maybe the HOA president believed she could push him around like everyone else in the neighborhood. Maybe she thought he would panic or quietly tear down the workshop. But Ethan Carter had spent years dealing with contractors, inspectors, and city officials. He understood paperwork, and he understood rules. If Linda Marshall wanted a fight about rules. She had just picked the wrong neighbor. Ethan closed the laptop. Outside, the sun was starting to set behind the houses of Silver Oak Meadows. Everything looked peaceful, perfect lawns, quiet streets, children riding bikes. But Ethan knew something the rest of the neighborhood didn't yet realize. A storm had just started. And the HOA president had no idea how big that storm was about to become. Because the next morning, Ethan was going to visit the county record's office, and what he would discover there would change this neighborhood forever. The next morning, Ethan Carter was already in his truck before the sun fully rose over Silver Oak Meadows. The HOA letter sat on the passenger seat. He glanced at it once more before starting the engine. 14 days, $250 a day, remove the workshop. The more he thought about it, the less it made sense. And Ethan Carter hated things that didn't make sense. The county record's office was about 20 minutes away, located in a plain government building surrounded by half-empty parking lots and faded flags. The kind of place people only visited when they absolutely had to. Ethan parked, grabbed his permit folder, and walked inside. The air smelled like paper, coffee, and old carpet. Behind the front desk sat a middle-aged clerk wearing reading glasses and typing slowly on an outdated computer. She looked up. "Can I help you?" Ethan placed his folder on the counter. "Yeah, I need to confirm something about a building permit." She adjusted her glasses. "Address: 417 Oak Ridge Lane." The clerk typed for a few seconds, then paused. Ethan noticed the hesitation. "What?" She clicked a few more things. "Well, your permit is here." "That's good." "Yes, but there's also something else." Ethan leaned slightly forward. "What kind of something else?" The clerk turned the monitor slightly so he could see it. There was a note attached to his permit record, a formal request. Submitted 3 weeks ago. Request for structure review. Submitted by HOA representative. Ethan frowned. "HOA?" "Yes," the clerk said. "Someone from your homeowners association contacted the county asking us to reevaluate the structure." Ethan felt a slow irritation building in his chest. "Did they say why?" The clerk scrolled. "It says, potential violation of community zoning expectations." Ethan let out a short laugh. "That's not even a real zoning category." The clerk smiled awkwardly. "No, it's not." So what happened? Well, she continued, an inspector reviewed the request. She clicked again, and the structure was confirmed as fully compliant with county building codes. Ethan nodded. That's what I expected. But the clerk hadn't finished. There's also a note from the inspector. What? She opened another tab. Ethan read the line slowly. Structure approved, no violation. HOA complaint appears unrelated to county regulation. Ethan leaned back slightly. So the county had already looked into it, and they had already confirmed the workshop was legal, which meant the HOA letter wasn't about safety or permits or regulations, it was about something else. Can I get a printed copy of that note? Ethan asked. The clerk nodded. Of course. A few minutes later, Ethan walked back to his truck holding several new documents. The official inspection confirmation, the county's written statement, and the HOA complaint record. He placed them carefully into his folder. Now he had proof, real proof, but something still bothered him. If the county had already rejected the HOA complaint, why was Linda Marshall still demanding he remove the workshop? Unless... She thought he didn't know. Ethan sat quietly for a moment, then another thought crossed his mind. What if this wasn't just about him? What if Linda had done this before? Back in Silver Oak Meadows, the neighborhood looked exactly the same as always. Calm, perfect, controlled. But Ethan now noticed something he hadn't before. A lot of backyards were empty. No sheds, no workshops, no extra structures, which was strange. In most suburban neighborhoods, people built small additions all the time. Garden sheds, storage units, playhouses, but here, almost nothing. Ethan parked his truck and walked down the street toward Tom's house. Tom was outside again, working on his lawnmower. Hey, Tom said, any luck? Ethan held up the documents. The county approved everything. Tom blinked, so the workshop's legal. Completely. Then what's the problem? Ethan handed him one of the papers. Tom read it. His eyebrows slowly lifted. Wait, the HOA already asked the county to review this. 3 weeks ago. And the county said it's fine. Yep. Tom looked back at Ethan. So Linda knows it's legal. Ethan nodded slowly. Exactly. Tom leaned against his lawnmower. That's actually worse. Why? Because it means she's not enforcing rules. Tom paused. She's enforcing power. Ethan looked around the quiet street. A few houses down, Linda Marshall's large white house stood perfectly maintained. Not a single leaf out of place. Everything about it screamed control. Tom lowered his voice. You know something weird. What? 3 years ago, my neighbor Dave tried to build a small garage behind his house. And the HOA shut it down. But was it legal? Tom shrugged. He never checked. They scared him with fines and he tore it down. Ethan felt that irritation growing stronger. Anyone else? Tom thought for a moment. Actually, yeah. He pointed down the block. See that blue house? Ethan nodded. Family there tried building a tool shed last year. Same thing happened. And they removed it. 2 weeks later. Ethan crossed his arms. So Linda sends violation letters. Yep. The people panic. Yep. And nobody checks the county permits. What? Tom looked impressed. You're starting to see the pattern. Ethan stared down the street. One HOA president, dozens of homeowners, all following rules they didn't fully understand. Or maybe. Rules that didn't actually exist. And if that was true, then Linda Marshall wasn't just controlling the neighborhood, she was manipulating it. Ethan turned back toward his house. When's that HOA meeting again? Tom asked. Thursday, 7. Tom whistled. That's going to be interesting. Ethan smiled slightly. Oh, I'm counting on it. That evening, Ethan sat at his kitchen table organizing documents. Permit approval, inspection report, county statement, HOA complaint record, everything neatly stacked. If Linda Marshall wanted to challenge him in front of the neighborhood, he would be ready. But as he prepared his papers, something else caught his attention. At the bottom of the HOA complaint form, there was a name, not just Linda Marshall, another signature, approved by HOA Compliance Committee. Ethan frowned, Compliance Committee. He flipped through the HOA paperwork he had received when buying the house 2 years ago. Buried deep in the documents was a list of board members, president, treasurer, secretary, and 3 members of something called the Compliance Committee. Ethan read the names slowly, then he stopped. One name stood out immediately because he recognized it: Mark Halpern. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Mark Halpern lived directly behind him. And 3 weeks ago, Mark had complained about the sound of Ethan's power tools. At the time, it seemed like a minor argument between neighbors. Now it looked very different. Ethan leaned back in his chair. So this wasn't just Linda Marshall. There were others involved. People who had the authority to issue violations. People who could influence HOA decisions, and if they were working together. Then the workshop wasn't the real problem. It was the excuse. Ethan closed the folder slowly. Thursday night was supposed to be a simple HOA review hearing, but now it felt more like a trap. The kind designed to pressure him into submission, to scare him, to isolate him. But Linda Marshall had made one critical mistake. She assumed Ethan Carter would react like everyone else in Silver Oak Meadows. Quiet, obedient, afraid of fines, but Ethan wasn't afraid. And the more he looked at the paperwork in front of him, the more he realized something important. This wasn't just about defending his workshop anymore. Because if Linda and her committee had been abusing their authority for years, then there might be dozens of homeowners in this neighborhood who had been forced to remove perfectly legal structures. Dozens of people who had paid fines they never actually owed. Which meant the HOA might have a much bigger problem than one workshop. Ethan closed the folder, a slow, determined smile forming on his face. Thursday night was only 2 days away. And when that meeting started, the HOA board expected to see a nervous homeowner asking for mercy. Instead, they were about to face someone who had spent the last 48 hours uncovering the first cracks in their entire system. And Ethan Carter had a feeling. Those cracks were about to turn into something much bigger. By Thursday evening, the small community hall of Silver Oak Meadows was already filling with residents. The HOA meetings were usually boring. A few complaints about trash bins, someone arguing about parking rules, Linda Marshall giving long speeches about protecting neighborhood standards. Most people attended once or twice and then never again. But tonight felt different. Word had spread quickly. Ethan Carter was challenging the HOA, and in a neighborhood controlled by strict rules and quiet pressure, that was unusual, very unusual. Ethan parked his truck across the street and sat there for a moment, watching people walk inside the building. Some looked curious, some looked nervous, some avoided eye contact with him entirely. He grabbed the folder from the passenger seat. Inside it were the documents he had spent the last 2 days collecting: county permits, inspection approvals, copies of the HOA complaint, and something else, something far more interesting. After his conversation with Tom, Ethan had spent hours knocking on doors, not aggressively, just casually asking questions. At first, people were hesitant. No one wanted trouble with the HOA, but once Ethan mentioned the violation letter, the stories started coming out. One neighbor had been fined for installing solar panels that were fully approved by the city. Another had been forced to remove a garden greenhouse even though it met all local codes. Someone else had paid nearly $3,000 in fines for a backyard deck that was later approved by county inspectors. Different situations, different houses, but the same pattern. The HOA claimed something was non-compliant. Homeowners panicked. They paid fines or removed structures, and the complaints quietly disappeared. Most people never questioned it, but Ethan had, and once he started digging, he found something that bothered him even more: the HOA's financial reports. Public HOA records were surprisingly easy to access online. And when Ethan looked at the numbers from the last 5 years, one detail stood out immediately. Violation fines had increased by nearly 400%. 400%. That wasn't normal. That wasn't enforcement. That looked like a business model. Ethan stepped out of his truck. Tonight wasn't just about defending his workshop anymore. It was about exposing something much bigger. Inside the hall, rows of metal folding chairs faced a long table at the front of the room. Behind that table sat the HOA board. Linda Marshall was in the center, perfect posture, perfect smile, perfect control. To her right sat the treasurer, a quiet man named Paul Simmons. To her left sat the compliance committee representative, Mark Halpern, Ethan's neighbor. Mark noticed Ethan entering the room and immediately looked away. Interesting. Ethan took a seat near the back. Tom sat beside him. "You ready for this?" Tom whispered. Ethan nodded calmly. "Oh, yeah." At exactly 7 o'clock, Linda tapped a small wooden gavel on the table. The room slowly quieted. "Good evening, residents of Silver Oak Meadows," she said with a professional smile. "As always, our goal is to maintain the beauty and property values of our community." A few people nodded politely. Linda continued. "Tonight we will begin with a compliance review regarding a structural violation at 417 Oak Ridge Lane." Several heads turned toward Ethan. Linda folded her hands. "Mr. Carter, please come forward." Ethan stood. The room felt strangely quiet as he walked to the front. Linda's smile never changed. "Mr. Carter," she said smoothly, "your recently constructed backyard structure has been identified as non-compliant with HOA guidelines. The board has reviewed the situation and determined that removal of the structure is required." Ethan didn't sit, he remained standing. "Can I ask a question first?" he said. Linda tilted her head slightly. "You may." Ethan opened his folder. "Did the HOA submit a review request to the county regarding my workshop?" The question clearly caught her off guard, just for a moment. Then she recovered. "Yes," she said calmly. "We wanted to verify the structure's compliance." Ethan nodded, and the county inspector approved it. Linda's smile tightened. County approval does not override HOA community standards. Ethan expected that answer, so he pulled out another paper. "This is the county inspection report." He placed it on the table. "According to this document, the structure is fully compliant with all zoning and building codes." Some residents leaned forward in their chairs. Linda barely glanced at the paper. "As I said, HOA standards are separate." Ethan nodded again. "I understand that." He turned toward the audience. "But here's the interesting part." He lifted another document. "This is the HOA complaint submitted 3 weeks ago." He placed it beside the first paper. "And here's the inspector's note." Ethan read it out loud. "Structure approved. No violation. HOA complaint appears unrelated to county regulation." A quiet murmur spread across the room. Linda's smile was gone now. "That statement is irrelevant to HOA guidelines," she said sharply. Ethan looked directly at her. "Is it?" He turned back to the residents. "Because I spent the last 2 days talking to some of you." Now the room was completely silent. "And it turns out my situation isn't unique." He lifted a small stack of papers. "Solar panels that were removed. Garden sheds that were demolished. Decks that were fined. All legally approved by the county." A few people in the audience began whispering. Linda tapped the gavel harder. "Mr. Carter, this meeting is not a platform for accusations." Ethan met her eyes calmly. "I'm not accusing anyone." He paused. "I'm asking a question." He looked around the room. How many people here were told their property improvements violated HOA rules without ever checking county permits? Slowly, hands began to rise, first one, then another, then 3 more. The room filled with quiet tension. Linda's expression hardened. "Those situations were reviewed individually." Ethan nodded. "Maybe." He lifted one more document, but according to the HOA's financial records. He paused deliberately. "Violation fines have increased by 400% in the last 5 years." The whispering grew louder. Linda slammed the gavel again. "Mr. Carter, you are out of order." But Ethan wasn't finished. He looked directly at Mark Halpern. "Mark, you're on the compliance committee, right?" Mark shifted uncomfortably. "Yes." "And you approved the complaint against my workshop." Mark cleared his throat. "The committee reviews structural concerns." Ethan leaned slightly closer. "Did you know the county had already approved it?" Mark hesitated. That hesitation lasted only 2 seconds, but it was enough. The room noticed, and suddenly, everything felt different, for the first time since the meeting started. Linda Marshall didn't look in control anymore. She looked angry. Very angry. "Mr. Carter," she said coldly, "this meeting is about your violation, not the HOA's operations." Ethan slowly closed his folder. "Then let's talk about my violation." He slid the county approval documents directly in front of her. "You're demanding I remove a structure that the county has already approved." He paused, "And if I don't, you plan to charge me $250 a day." Linda said nothing. The entire room waited. Ethan crossed his arms. "So I just want to clarify something." His voice stayed calm, controlled, but every word landed heavily in the silent hall. "Are you asking me to destroy a legally approved structure?" He leaned slightly forward. "Or are you threatening me with fines if I don't?" Linda Marshall stared at him. And for the first time since the meeting began, she didn't immediately have an answer, but what she said next would turn a simple HOA dispute into something far more dangerous. The silence inside the community hall stretched longer than anyone expected. Dozens of residents were staring at the front table. Some were confused, some were curious, but many of them were starting to look suspicious. Linda Marshall sat perfectly still for several seconds. Her fingers rested on the table beside the small wooden gavel, and the confident smile she had worn at the beginning of the meeting had completely disappeared. For years, these meetings had been simple. She spoke. Residents listened, rules were announced, fines were issued, end of discussion. No one questioned her authority. No one challenged the board, but tonight something had gone very wrong. Ethan Carter had come prepared, and worse. He had brought the truth with him. Linda slowly pushed the county documents back toward Ethan. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm again, but colder than before. "Mr. Carter, the HOA has the authority to enforce community appearance standards." Ethan didn't sit down. "I understand that," he said. Linda continued. "Your structure may meet county codes, but it still violates HOA design guidelines." Ethan tilted his head slightly. "Which guideline?" Linda blinked once. "The structure does not match the aesthetic design of the neighborhood." Ethan nodded slowly. "So the problem isn't safety?" "No. And it isn't zoning." "No. It's appearance." Linda folded her hands. "Yes." Several residents exchanged looks. Even Tom, sitting near the back, quietly shook his head. Ethan opened his folder again and pulled out another paper. "I read the HOA handbook very carefully yesterday." Linda's eyes narrowed slightly. "And?" she asked. Ethan held up the document. "According to Section 4.2, accessory structures are permitted if they are located behind the property fence and not visible from the street." He paused. "My workshop meets both of those requirements." A few people in the audience nodded. Linda leaned back in her chair. "That section still requires board approval." Ethan smiled slightly. "Actually, it says committee review, not board approval." He turned and looked directly at Mark Halpern. "Which means the compliance committee." Mark suddenly looked like he wished he were anywhere else. Ethan continued. "And according to HOA meeting records from last year." He flipped another page. "The compliance committee never reviewed my structure." Now the whispering in the room grew louder. Linda tapped the gavel again, but this time the sound didn't restore order like it used to, because the residents weren't just listening anymore. They were thinking. And thinking led to questions, dangerous questions. Linda's voice sharpened. "Mr. Carter, you're misinterpreting the rules." Ethan didn't raise his voice. "AMI." He placed 3 documents on the table in front of her. The permit, the inspection approval, and the HOA guideline. Then he added one more, the financial report, and this. Linda didn't even look at it. "I fail to see the relevance." Ethan looked around the room. "This report shows HOA fine revenue increasing from $30,000 a year to nearly $120,000. Several residents gasped quietly. That was a lot of money for a small neighborhood. Linda's expression hardened. Those funds are used for community improvements. Ethan nodded, of course. He paused, but most of those fines come from structural violations. He looked directly at the audience now, structures that were later approved by the county. The room was no longer quiet. People were whispering openly. One older man in the second row raised his hand. "Excuse me," he said loudly. "My daughter had to remove a greenhouse 2 years ago because the HOA said it wasn't allowed." Another woman spoke up. "My husband paid almost $2,000 in fines for our deck." Someone else added, "We had to tear down our shed." The voices began stacking on top of each other. Linda slammed the gavel again. Order. But the calm control she once had over these meetings was gone. The residents were realizing something uncomfortable. Maybe the HOA rules weren't as clear as they thought. Maybe the fines weren't as justified as they believed. And maybe, just maybe, they had been pushed into compliance without ever questioning it. Ethan let the conversation build for a few seconds. Then he spoke again. "Look, I'm not here to start a war." That sentence made several people quiet down. "I built my workshop legally." He gestured toward the documents. "I followed county rules. I followed HOA guidelines. And I'm not tearing it down." Linda stared at him. "That's not your decision." Ethan met her gaze calmly. "Actually, it is." He leaned slightly closer to the table. "Because if the HOA tries to fine me for a legally approved structure." He paused. "That becomes a legal issue." Now the room went completely silent again. Linda's eyes narrowed. "Are you threatening the board?" Ethan shook his head. "No." Another small pause. "I'm warning you." Mark Halpern shifted nervously beside Linda. Paul Simmons, the treasurer, looked like he suddenly regretted being part of the board. Linda, however, refused to back down. "You moved into this neighborhood knowing there were rules," she said sharply. Ethan nodded. "Yes. And I followed them." Linda leaned forward slightly. "The board has the authority to determine compliance." Ethan didn't hesitate, and homeowners have the right to challenge decisions. He picked up his folder, and if necessary, he closed it slowly. "In court." That word hit the room like a thunderclap. Court. No one in Silver Oak Meadows had ever taken the HOA to court, not once, because HOAs were intimidating. They had lawyers, money, power, but Ethan Carter didn't look intimidated, not even a little. Linda stared at him for a long moment. Then she said something that surprised everyone. "Very well." Her voice was calm again, controlled. "If you choose not to remove the structure, the HOA will begin issuing fines starting tomorrow." Several residents gasped. Even Tom muttered under his breath, but Ethan didn't react. He simply nodded. "Okay." Linda blinked. "You understand that the fine is $250 per day?" "Yes." "And it will continue until the structure is removed." Ethan shrugged lightly. "Then I guess we'll see what happens." Linda studied him carefully now. Something about his calm confidence clearly bothered her. Because most homeowners, when faced with daily fines, would panic. They would negotiate. They would apologize, but Ethan Carter looked almost relaxed, and that made Linda uneasy, very uneasy, because what she didn't know, what no one in that room knew yet, was that Ethan Carter had already taken another step earlier that afternoon. A step that would turn this HOA conflict into something far bigger than a neighborhood dispute. Because just 3 hours before the meeting, Ethan had visited a law office downtown, and the lawyer he spoke to had said something very interesting after reviewing the documents, something that was still echoing in Ethan's mind as he walked out of the community hall that night. The lawyer had leaned back in his chair and said, "Mr. Carter, if what you're telling me is accurate." He paused. "Your HOA might be facing something called abuse of authority." Ethan had asked a simple question. "What does that mean?" The lawyer smiled slightly. "It means..." He tapped the financial report with his finger. "They may have been collecting illegal fines for years. And if that turned out to be true..." Silver Oak Meadows wasn't about to witness a simple HOA disagreement. It was about to witness something much bigger, something that could destroy the HOA board completely. And Ethan Carter had just decided. He wasn't going to stop until the truth came out. The next morning, the first fine arrived exactly as Linda Marshall promised. Ethan Carter found the notice taped neatly to his front door. HOA violation, Day 1. Fine issued, $250. He stood there for a moment reading it. Then he calmly pulled it off the door, folded it once, and walked back inside his house. No anger, no panic, just quiet focus. Because the truth was, Ethan had already expected this. What Linda didn't realize was that the fine she issued that morning would become the biggest mistake she had made in years. Inside the kitchen, Ethan placed the violation notice on the table beside a growing stack of paperwork, county permits, inspection reports, HOA financial statements, signed statements from several neighbors, and the business card of the lawyer he had visited the day before. Daniel Brooks, Real Estate and Property Law. Ethan picked up his phone and dialed the number. Daniel answered after 2 rings. "Good morning, Mr. Carter." Ethan looked at the new violation notice. They started the fines. There was a small pause on the other end of the line. "Good," Daniel said. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Good." "Yes," the lawyer replied calmly, "because now we have proof." "Proof of what?" "Proof that the HOA is knowingly enforcing a penalty against a legally approved structure." Ethan sat down at the table. "And that helps us." Daniel chuckled slightly. "It helps us a lot." Because during their meeting the day before, Daniel had explained something important. HOAs did have authority, but they also had limits. And if an HOA intentionally issued fines that violated local regulations or ignored legal permits, that wasn't just a disagreement, that could become a lawsuit, and not a small one. "Have you spoken to any other residents?" Daniel asked. "About 8, Ethan said. Most of them had similar situations." "Did any of them pay fines?" "Several." Daniel's tone changed slightly. "Then this might be bigger than we thought." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "How big?" The lawyer took a breath. "If multiple homeowners were pressured into paying fines for violations that didn't legally exist." He paused. "That could qualify as fraudulent enforcement." Ethan looked down at the documents on his table. Suddenly, the situation felt very different. Because this wasn't just about defending his workshop anymore. Now it was about the entire neighborhood. Later that afternoon, Ethan walked across the street to Tom's house. Tom opened the door holding a cup of coffee. "Let me guess," he said. "The fines started." Ethan nodded. Tom sighed. "Linda never backs down." Ethan handed him a paper. Tom read it slowly. Then his eyes widened. "Wait, this says homeowners might be able to recover past fines." Ethan nodded again. "That's what the lawyer thinks." Tom looked stunned. "You're telling me people here might actually get their money back?" "Possibly." Tom stared down the quiet street. "You know what that means, right?" Ethan smiled slightly. "Oh, yeah." It meant the HOA board wasn't just risking embarrassment anymore. They were risking lawsuits, plural, and lawsuits meant investigations, and investigations meant the financial records would be examined very closely, something Linda Marshall probably never expected. By Thursday evening, 1 week after the original HOA meeting, the tension in Silver Oak Meadows had completely changed. Neighbors were talking, comparing stories, looking through old violation notices. Several people had even printed copies of the county permit rules Ethan had shared. For the first time in years, the HOA board wasn't controlling the narrative. The residents were asking questions, and Linda Marshall was starting to feel the pressure. 2 days later, Ethan received another letter, but this one looked very different. It wasn't a violation notice. It was an official HOA meeting announcement. Emergency board meeting, Saturday 6:00 p.m. Tom laughed when he saw it. "Emergency meeting," he said. "That's new." Ethan smiled. "They're nervous." And they had a good reason to be, because earlier that same day, Daniel Brooks had sent the HOA board a formal legal notice. The letter was short, direct, and impossible to ignore. It explained that the HOA was currently issuing fines against a structure legally approved by the county. It also stated that multiple homeowners had experienced similar enforcement actions, and at the bottom of the letter was one very serious sentence. If these actions are not immediately reviewed and corrected, our office will pursue legal remedies, including financial recovery for affected homeowners. When the emergency HOA meeting began Saturday night, the room was packed. More residents had shown up than ever before. Linda Marshall still sat at the center of the table, but the confidence she once carried was gone. Her voice was quieter, less certain. She cleared her throat and looked out at the room. The HOA board has conducted an internal review regarding recent compliance procedures. Ethan stood quietly near the back of the room. Listening, waiting, Linda continued. After reviewing county documentation and community guidelines, she paused. The board has decided to withdraw the violation notice issued to Mr. Carter. A wave of whispers spread across the room. Tom leaned over. That was fast. But Linda wasn't finished. The fines issued this week will also be canceled. Another ripple of conversation filled the hall. Linda gripped the table slightly tighter. And the HOA will be conducting a broader review of past structural violations. Now several people in the audience began raising their hands, but Linda quickly added one final sentence. Additionally, she hesitated for just a second. I will be stepping down as HOA president effective immediately. The room went completely silent. Even Ethan hadn't expected that. Mark Halpern stood up slowly beside her. I will also be resigning from the compliance committee. The quiet tension in the room suddenly broke into a wave of voices. Some shocked, some relieved, some quietly satisfied. Ethan simply watched, because the truth was he never wanted to destroy the HOA. He just wanted the truth to come out, and now it had. Later that night, Ethan stood in his backyard looking at the small wooden workshop he had built. The lights inside glowed softly, tools neatly arranged on the walls, a workbench ready for the projects he had always planned. Tom leaned over the fence. So, what happens now? Ethan smiled. Now. He looked around the peaceful neighborhood. Now people know they can ask questions. Tom chuckled. Yeah, I think Linda forgot something important. What's that? Tom pointed at the quiet street. This neighborhood belongs to the homeowners. Ethan nodded. Exactly, and sometimes all it took was one person refusing to back down. Because when the HOA called his workshop non-compliant, they expected him to quietly tear it down. But instead, Ethan Carter had done something much more dangerous. He asked them to prove it, and that simple question had changed Silver Oak Meadows forever.